I'll just
Okay.
finish the recording from one session to the next, Helen. It's fine.
Okay. I think we
That's
seem to
okay,
have
I've
a slight swap.
Yeah, it's fine.
So what we're going into now is something that we've covered quite a lot over the years on the conference, which is Ambridge family dynamics. Now, family, can't live with them, can't stop them turning up in the bull. So this next session explores everything from the trials of child-free choices to crime and rehabilitation, to who's the best granddad in Borsetshire. And spoiler alert, it's not always who you think. So I will welcome our first speaker, who is Louise Gillies. Nearly called you Louise Mary there.
Not been remarried. Let me share my screen. Oh, can someone let me share my screen?
You should be able to do it. You should be able to do it, Lou.
It's not letting me. Oh, here we go. We just love Zoom.
You need hold music for times like this.
I think we do need some hold music. It's not, my settings aren't letting me share my screen. How typical is that?
Do you want me to run it from here?
Oh, hang on a sec. Yeah, I think you're gonna have to. Let me think we might have to. Oh no, here we go.
I was just about to start singing.
That worked.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Can you see the whole thing now? Or is
Not
it?
yet.
There we go. How's that? Is that better?
Yes, that's right, Lou. That's fab.
Right. Okay, so my presentation is going to explore the portrayal of Harrison and Fallon Burns and their choice not to have children. And the storyline is particularly compelling because it highlights the evolving social attitudes towards parenthood, personal choice, and the emotional complexities that come with it. So obviously this is a sensitive subject, and what I hope to portray is that The Archers presents this issue, the issue of being childless by choice, with nuance and empathy, and allows a space for both perspectives to be valid. It doesn't take sides, but it tells a story that mirrors real life dilemmas and the deeply personal nature of reproductive choice. If you are affected by anything I talk about, please do reach out to me either directly afterwards once I finish, or maybe Cara, Helen, or team while I'm talking. So I'm going to examine how the Archers realistically portrayed the complexities of the choice to remain child-free for Harrison and Fallon, about emotional regulation in relationships and societal expectations surrounding family life. We'll also explore counselling insights. And this fits in with my current work as a reproductive health counsellor. I work with individuals and couples who are in similar situations to Fallon and Harrison, those who are making a choice whether or not to have children. Can someone mute? Thanks. Where was I? Oh yeah, so yeah, those who are making a choice whether or not to have children, those who are going through the anguish of pregnancy loss, those who aren't on the same page or in different stages of grief. For clarification, I'm going to be using the terms child-free by choice and maybe occasionally voluntary childlessness throughout the talk. And I'm defining these terms as referring to an individual who's made a deliberate and personal choice not to have children. So I wanted to start with some quotes which you can read while I'm talking. And these come from women who chose a child-free life. They come from within the academic Archers community, and their experiences contributed to my need to present this paper, along with some of the social media backlash towards Fallon's choice and Harrison's perceived uncharacteristic behaviour. Reproductive choice comes in many forms, and all are equally valid and personal. Yet Chelsea received more support around her termination from listeners on social media than Fallon has for making a decision not to have a child. It seems that everyone has an opinion when someone doesn't have children. So, quick bit of background. Over the past few decades, we've seen an increase in individuals and couples choosing to remain child-free. And in the UK, around 1 in 5 women now reach their mid-40s without having children, of which approximately 10% are child-free by choice. Motivations for this choice vary, ranging from career aspirations, financial independence and lifestyle preferences, to environmental concerns, personal fulfillment outside of parenthood. And one of the more common ones these days is just not having an affinity for babies and children. However, attitudes towards child-free choice differ significantly between urban and rural areas. Studies show that 78% of urban populations view voluntary childlessness as an acceptable lifestyle choice, compared to only 42% in rural communities. This divide is largely driven by cultural expectations, traditional family values, and societal pressures in rural areas, where having children is often seen as a fundamental life stage. In contrast, urban areas tend to have more diverse lifestyles and greater social acceptance of non-traditional family structures. Living in a rural setting, Fallon's strong stance on being child-free places her at odds with the traditional expectations of family life in Ambridge. Meanwhile, Harrison's internal conflict, his desire for fatherhood versus his love for Fallon, is intensified by these broader societal expectations. Their story reflects a real-world debate on autonomy, relationships, and the shifting meaning of family. Beyond their personal struggles, Fallon and Harrison have faced these external pressures from family, from the Ambridge community. In a rural setting like Ambridge, the expectation to have children is deeply ingrained. Parenthood is seen as a natural milestone, and child-free couples are often met with curiosity, pity, and judgment. For Fallon, these pressures have always been present. She's never let them affect her decision, though. She's long been comfortable rejecting traditional expectations. She's refused to justify her choice or conform just to meet societal norms. Harrison, however, things are more complicated. He's well respected in the community, and he probably knew that people assumed that he and Fallon would eventually start a family. After a miscarriage, he may have felt a quiet, unspoken pressure, not just from the outside world, but from within himself. Was he missing out on something? Was Fallon's decision holding him back from a life that others seemed to find self-fulfilling? This added to his emotional turmoil. He didn't want to resent Fallon. He loves her deeply. But he also can't ignore the questions that have been stirred up by that experience. The influence of societal expectations, family opinions, and traditional rural values made their situation even more complex. This is some of the work that I actually do. That's counselling for those, usually women, who are undecided about parenthood. And the therapy around reproductive decision-making helps individuals to explore their feelings in a non-judgmental space. And we guide individuals through questions such as, do I really want children? Do I feel pressured by society? How do I envision my life with or without children? What fears and uncertainties are influencing my indecision? And we usually work on this for about 3 months, while mostly from me anyway, the women tries to come to a decision. But the therapy allows people to separate the personal desires from external pressures, helping them to reach a more clear decision that feels authentic to them. And it also provides tools to manage potential regret, external judgment, and relationship dynamics as well. So let's look at Fallon's perspective. From the beginning, Fallon has been firm and steadfast and consistent in her decision not to have children. Unlike many who waver or feel pressured by societal expectations, Fallon's always known that parenthood isn't for her. Her reasoning is rooted in personal autonomy, lifestyle preferences, and a desire to live life on her own terms. In rural communities such as Ambridge, where traditional family values remain strong, this decision may still be seen as unconventional, especially for women. For Fallon, choosing to be child-free isn't a temporary stance or something she expects to change. She rejects the idea that motherhood is the natural and inevitable step after marriage. Her conversations with Harrison made it clear that she doesn't believe having children should be an obligation or a compromise. And while she loves Harrison, she understood that their values had to be aligned on this issue for their relationship to be sustainable. Fallon's stance represents a growing cultural shift where more individuals, especially women, feel empowered to define their lives beyond the traditional goals. But what does this mean for Harrison? So unlike Fallon, Harrison's always imagined fatherhood as part of his future, a natural step after marriage. At first, Harrison's reaction to Fallon's stance was likely a mix of shock and disappointment. He'd never truly considered a life without children, and Fallon's firm stance forced him to reevaluate his own expectations. He struggled with the idea of letting go of a future that he'd always envisioned, one that he would raise a family and experience fatherhood. However, his love for Fallon seemed stronger than his personal desire for children. So instead of trying to change her mind, he chose to prioritise their relationship, even if it meant sacrificing something so deeply meaningful to him. He told himself that if Fallon was certain, then he would learn to be content with the life they had together. But even as he outwardly accepted Fallon's choice, his internal conflict remained unresolved. His suppressed feelings, convincing himself that he didn't need children to be happy. And however, as we're all aware, this unspoken conflict would later resurface in unexpected ways when Fallon became pregnant. So, although Harrison assured Fallon that he'd accepted her decision, deep down he continued to struggle. His desire for fatherhood didn't just disappear, and instead it lingered beneath the surface, creating an internal conflict that he didn't always know how to process. Part of his struggle came from his own expectations and societal influences. In Ambridge, family is the heart of the community, as I've already said. Many of his friends and colleagues are parents, and conversations about family life are commonplace. And this reinforces the idea that having children is a natural, expected milestone. So while Fallon felt empowered by her choice, Harrison felt like he was giving something up. At times, he questioned himself, could he truly be happy without children? Would he regret this decision in the future? These thoughts created moments of doubt, but he never vocalised them to Fallon. Instead, he convinced himself that their love was enough, that he would adapt, even if it meant setting aside his own desires. But suppressing emotions is rarely sustainable. And then everything changed when Fallon unexpectedly became pregnant. And this was the moment where all Harrison's buried emotions came rushing to the surface. So let's explore how he reacted to a pregnancy and how he reshaped his understanding of what he really wanted. When Fallon discovered she was pregnant, it was a moment of shock, not just for her, but for Harrison as well. This was something neither of them had planned, and for Fallon, it was an unwanted disruption to the life she had carefully chosen. But for Harrison, the news stirred up buried emotions and a possibility he had secretly grieved. At first, Harrison's reaction was conflicted. He wanted to be supportive of Fallon, but he also felt an unexpected surge of hope. A part of him had convinced himself that fatherhood was something he had to let go of, but now it was suddenly real, right in front of him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it could be like to be a father. And this was where his internal battle became most intense. On one hand, he knew that Fallon didn't want this pregnancy, and that she remained unwavering in her stance about not having children. On the other, he felt a deep emotional pull toward the idea of fatherhood, something he had spent so long suppressing. He started to wonder, was this his one and only chance? Though he never pressured Fallon, his hesitation and silent longing were palpable. He struggled to balance his own emotions with his love and respect for Fallon. The situation forced him to confront something he'd avoided for so long. Was he truly okay with living a child-free life, or had he only convinced himself that he was? But just as he was beginning to process these emotions, everything changed again. Fallon miscarried, and with that loss, Harrison found himself facing not only grief, but a deep, unexpected emotional turmoil. So Fallon's miscarriage was a turning point, not just because of a physical loss of a pregnancy, but because of what it meant emotionally for both of them. For Fallon, it was confirmation that of what she already knew. She never wanted children, and now she could move forward without having to confront an unwanted situation. But for Harrison, the miscarriage triggered a wave of complex emotions that he wasn't prepared for. He'd not been able to suppress his excitement, despite knowing that Fallon wasn't on the same page, but when the pregnancy ended, he realised that he was mourning something deeper than just the loss of a potential child. He was mourning the idea of fatherhood itself. This led to emotional dysregulation, where he struggled to make sense of his feelings. He wasn't just grieving the miscarriage, he was grappling with a long-standing, unspoken conflict about his future. He had told himself that he was content being child-free, but now he could no longer ignore the sense of loss and emptiness that had surfaced. This emotional struggle put strain on his relationship with Fallon. She was ready to move on, relieved that she didn't have to navigate parenthood. But Harrison found himself disconnected, unable to express what he was going through. He didn't want to make Fallon feel guilty, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that something inside him had changed. His grief, confusion, and unprocessed emotions would continue to manifest in significant ways. It affected his relationship with Fallon. It affected his sense of self. It affected his interactions with others. It affected his work. For Fallon, the miscarriage wasn't a moment of grief, it was relief. She'd never wanted children. The pregnancy had thrown her into a situation she'd chosen actively to avoid. And now that it was over, she felt like she could reclaim control over her life and move forward without the looming weight of parenthood. Unlike Harrison, who struggled with unspoken loss, Fallon didn't feel a sense of mourning. Instead, she saw it as a reaffirmation of her values. She'd always known herself, and this only solidified her belief that a child-free life was right for her. In her mind, the miscarriage had put an end to something she hadn't wanted in the first place. However, a pragmatic response created an emotional gap between her and Harrison. While Fallon was ready to move on, Harrison was still processing grief, disappointment, and questions about his future. Fallon may not have fully understood the depth of his pain, especially since he had spent so much time convincing himself that he'd accepted a child-free life. She might not have wanted to appreciate his pain. This disconnect between them began to subtly change and shape their relationship, highlighting how two people can experience the same event in completely different ways. Fallon saw it as a return to normality, but Harrison was left with unresolved emotions that he didn't know how to express. And this emotional divide would continue to linger beneath the surface, influencing their dynamic and possibly shaping the future of their marriage. For men like Harrison who have agreed to a child-free life but later experience unexpected feelings of loss or uncertainty, counselling focuses on grief processing, self-exploration and relationship navigation. Key aspects of therapy may include recognising and validating emotions around loss and longing, exploring whether desire for children is negotiable or fundamental to their happiness, communicating with their partner in a way that fosters understanding rather than pressure, and coping strategies for reconciling love for a partner with unfulfilled personal desires. One of the most difficult aspects of situations like Harrison's is the fear of resentment building up over time. So counselling aims to prevent emotional suppression, ensuring that both partners feel heard and understood while maintaining the integrity of their relationship. I'm not entirely sure that it was working for Fallon, much of their counselling together. Ultimately, reproductive counselling empowers individuals and couples to navigate these deeply personal decisions with clarity, confidence, and mutual respect. I usually see individuals, but occasionally couples will come together, maybe towards the end of the sessions. So I believe that one of the strengths of the Archers is its ability to explore emotional nuance in a way that feels deeply real. Fallon and Harrison's story isn't just about whether or not to have children, it's about love, compromise, identity, and the struggles that exist in relationships. Fallon's character represents the clarity and confidence of knowing one's own mind. She's never wavered in her decision to remain child-free, and the Archers portrays her not as selfish or misguided, but as a woman who is certain about what she wants from life. She refuses to conform to expectations, even when it causes tension in her marriage. Harrison, on the other hand, experiences a more complex emotional arc. He begins with quiet acceptance of Fallon's choice, but the pregnancy and miscarriage forced him to confront emotions he'd pushed aside. His grief, not just for the baby, but the version of his future that he now realises is never going to happen. What makes The Archer so special is that it doesn't reduce this issue to right or wrong. Instead, it allows space for both perspectives to be valid. Fallon isn't painted as cold or uncaring, and Harrison isn't portrayed as someone selfishly longing for children. Instead, we see two people who love each other deeply, but must navigate fundamental differences in their visions for the future. And this emotional depth is what makes The Archers resonate with listeners. It reflects real-life dilemmas where love and compatibility don't always align perfectly with the goals. So being purposefully child-free is often misunderstood. It's sometimes framed as selfishness, a temporary phase, or even as something people inevitably regret. However, research and personal experiences tell a different story. Choosing not to have children can be an empowering decision, rooted in a strong sense of identity, autonomy, and self-awareness. For Fallon, this empowerment comes from knowing what she wants and refusing to conform. She's built a life she loves, one that isn't centred around motherhood, and she doesn't see parenthood as a necessary part of fulfilment. For her, being child-free isn't a compromise, it's a choice that aligns with her values and aspirations. However, voluntary childlessness isn't without its challenges. Social pressure, family expectations, and personal relationships can complicate the experience. While Fallon stands firm in her decision, Harrison's journey highlights the other reality. Sometimes people aren't as sure as they think. He thought he'd accepted a child-free life, but the pregnancy and miscarriage forced him to confront lingering feelings of loss, certainty, and what-ifs. And this is what makes their story so compelling. It captures the duality of voluntary childlessness. On one hand, it can be a source of empowerment, clarity, and freedom. On the other, it can bring emotional challenges, especially when personal desires and relationships are at stake. Fallon and Harrison's journey reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. Every individual, every couple must navigate this choice in their own way. Oh, sorry, I seem to have gone backwards. To conclude, Harrison's and Fallon's journey in The Archers is about far more than just the decision to have children. It's a story about love, autonomy, societal expectations, and the complexities of relationships when fundamental values don't align. Their experiences reflect a broader cultural conversation about voluntary childlessness and the ways in which personal choice intersect with social norm. Fallon represents the empowerment of knowing oneself and standing firm in personal conviction, even in the face of external pressure. She challenges the assumption that parenthood is a necessary step in life, and she refuses to compromise her happiness for expectations she doesn't share. Harrison embodies the silent struggles of suppressed desires which haven't been fully worked through, someone who thought he could accept a child-free life, but then found himself questioning his own choices when confronted with the reality of an unplanned pregnancy. His emotional journey shows that acceptance isn't always simple and that grief can take many forms. Their story also highlights the urban-rural divide in attitudes towards child-free living, the pressure that relationships face when partners want different things, and the ways in which loss, expected or unexpected, can bring unspoken emotions to the surface. So, most importantly, I believe that The Archers presents this issue with nuance and empathy. It allowed space for both perspectives to be valid. It didn't take sides. It simply told a story that mirrors real-life dilemmas and the deeply personal nature of reproductive choices. And I'd particularly like to thank the academic Archers who chose to be child-free, who gave me insight, quotes, and read-throughs of this paper, and to my clients.
Thank you, Lou. That's fantastic. I really would like to be able to offer you the chance to respond to some of the comments, but I'm going to ask you to do that in the chat, if you would, so that we can then move on to the next speaker, who is Nicola Maxfield, who is going to talk about crime and redemption across a number of families in Ambridge. Are you there, Nick?
Hello, I'm here.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll let you get on.
Okay, let's get my slideshow going. Oops. Sorry about this. Trying to find one that actually works for me. That's it, share. Okay. So I'm hoping you're not seeing my next slide picture. Can you see that, Helen, Lou?
I'm just seeing the title picture.
Oh, cool. Something works. Wonderful. Thank you. So I'm looking at law and disorder in Ambridge. I thought the law and the law won because it always does. There are 4 men. There are at least 4 crimes. So I'm not quite sure if the Mentimeter is going to work. So I'm going to save that till right at the very end when I'm going to ask you who is the most criminal, the most disagreeable criminal in Ambridge. We'll leave that till the last slide, I think, and we'll make a start. So a few years ago, I looked at attachment styles in respect to Henry Archer to see whether he was going to become a serial killer. And I'm quite disappointed that we're having no signs there. So I thought we'd relook at attachment style and link it to criminal tendencies with some of the chaps in Ambridge. So Clive Horrobin, he is a career criminal and an abuser. He exhibits characteristics consistent with a disorganized attachment style. So this style typically develops from inconsistent, chaotic, or even traumatic childhood experiences, where a caregiver is both a comfort of source and fear. I'm wondering what Bert was like as a father. What was Ivy like? We can't marry up Tracy's loveliness with Clive's horribleness. Clive is violent, manipulative, unpredictable, which does suggest early experiences of neglect or abuse. His relationships tend to be dysfunctional as he struggles with trust and emotional regulation, often resulting to aggression and criminality. We then had Tom Archer. Tom shows many traits associated with an anxious attachment style. He seeks validation in relationships and tends to overthink his personal and professional decisions, particularly in his romantic life. His insecurity manifests in his need for control, both in business and relationships. The problem is that he's with Natasha and she's the one that wears the trousers. You know, he's never going to be in control in that relationship. This means that he's can end up making impulsive decisions. So think about his past engagements, business ventures. He struggles with self-doubt, and his tendency to push too hard for approval suggests underlying anxiety about being abandoned or failing. And we know because he did open up about his issues after John's death. So Tom's an interesting one. But then we have Freddie. He exhibits traits of an avoidant attachment style, shaped largely by the loss of his father, Nigel, and a strained relationship with his mother, Elizabeth. He has historically struggled with authority and responsibility, sometimes distancing himself emotionally and rebelling against expectations. His difficulties in forming close relationships and his preference for independence, even to his own detriment, suggest an underlying fear of dependence or rejection. His attempts at self-sufficiency, including drug-related troubles, point to emotional avoidance. And George, lovely George. He's still young, but his behaviour hints at either disorganised or avoidant attachment. Growing up with a turbulent family dynamic, with Ed and Will's strained relationship, and their relationship with George's mum, Emma, and her financial struggles, and the fact that he's a Grundy and understands the Grundy code, George has exhibited manipulative and provocative behaviours, particularly towards adults and authority figures. If he continues down this path, he may develop a disorganised attachment style marked by unpredictability and emotional instability, or an avoidance style where he distances himself from emotional connections to maintain control. So let's have a look at the crimes and the criminals. Clive, he has a smorgasbord of crimes. He has a proper portfolio, from the armed robbery to his targeting of George Barford. He's ended up with 12 years inside. And then Tom, who destroyed genetically modified, I think it was wheat, on his uncle's farm. But he got away with that, and we'll look at the reasons why shortly. I think Freddie's biggest crime is just being incredibly posh. I think that's worse than the drug dealing. But the drug dealing got him 12 months. And finally, we're back to George. George was convicted of perverting the course of justice and dangerous driving. He's been sent away for 2 years. So let's look at our criminals in a little bit more detail. Clive's got a long history of crime: burglary, violence, intimidation. As a working class character from Ambridge's rough family, he's been depicted as beyond redemption, receiving harsh sentences and social exclusion. His treatment reflects how the justice system often comes down harder on individuals from lower socio-economic backgrounds, reinforcing a cycle of poverty and criminality. Clive's lack of access to wealth, influence, or positive community ties means he is written off, whereas wealthier characters are given second chances. Freddie Pargeter. Even when he's not actively committing crimes, his past follows him, reinforcing his position as an outsider. This reflects how ex-offenders from marginalised backgrounds face continuous punishment beyond their sentences, struggling to find employment or social acceptance. So that's Clive. Is he just misunderstood? Tom. Golden Boy Tom has not learnt his lesson after being prosecuted for damaging crops. The prosecution didn't stick. However, as judge and jury, I've decided that his unethical business decisions, such as financial mismanagement and misleading customers, have shown him poor economic consequences. But he's not faced any legal repercussions. We'll probably find out that sewage gate is because he didn't do something. He left a gully blocked. This reflects his not facing legal repercussions, reflects broader societal trends where white-collar crime is often overlooked or treated with civil penalties rather than criminal ones. It underscores how individuals from wealthier or more established families can evade the full force of the law, unlike those committing more visible working class crimes. Compare Tom with Clive. Tom's back in a position of power and he's still making questionable decisions. The system prioritizes protecting economic stability over holding business people accountable, reinforcing capital biases in justice. Also see Brian Aldridge, Justin Elliott et al. Freddie, gentleman jailbird. His drug dealing conviction is a prime example of privilege within the justice system. As the son of Elizabeth Pargeter and a member of the landed gentry, his social status played a role in the relative leniency of his sentence and the community's willingness to reintegrate him post-prison. Come on, he's in an abattoir. He's got access to killing tools. You wouldn't give that to Clive, would you? He received sympathy despite committing a serious offence, highlighting disparities in how justice is applied depending on class and social connections. Freddie, as heir to Lower Loxley, benefits from what Pierre Bourdieu terms cultural capital. His elite social status grants him access to support networks that protect him from the full consequences of his drug dealing conviction. In contrast to Clive, who remains an outsider. Freddie is allowed redemption, reflecting how wealthier individuals often experience a more rehabilitative justice system. He's often perceived as a misguided young man rather than a true criminal. His label as a good lad from a good family softens public and legal responses, demonstrating the way middle and upper class deviance is excused or reframed as a learning experience rather than in an inherent flaw. And for examples, please see the previous Conservative cabinet. Let's move on to George. George has displayed troubling behaviour, including misogyny and vandalism. Problematic behaviour in privileged rural settings can be excused as boys being boys. And that's how he's been treated, his mum especially. Our George. Young offenders from marginalised, mainly urban backgrounds may be criminalised more swiftly. He's at a formative stage where he's not fully, I don't think, been labelled as deviant, but his misogynistic and antisocial behaviour has been excused by many around him. And indeed, look at his grandparents fawning over him, wanting to go and see him. That's no punishment, they're being punished. If unchecked, George's actions could escalate, yet his community may continue to shield him. George's behaviour can reflect broader systemic issues where patriarchal structures protect young men from accountability, allowing them to develop patterns of behaviour that could escalate into more serious offences. Now, George does have cultural capital, but it's cultural capital towards his granddad Eddie's way of life. So it will fit in prison. He's got the phrases, he's got the understanding to allow him to fit in and flourish in prison. But whether or not it allows him to come back and take a full part in life in Ambridge is another matter. In the UK, the prison system can be seen as socially unjust in many ways. It's often linked to broader issues of inequality and systemic disadvantage. So with the next couple of slides, think about who these statements could refer to. We can see that the UK prison population shows a disproportionate representation of certain minority ethnic groups. This suggests that systemic factors, including socio-economic inequalities and potential biases within the justice system, play a role. So while we may not think this links to anybody in the Archers, there is the potential for it too. We also have socioeconomic disadvantage. Imprisonment rates are often higher in areas of socioeconomic deprivation. People from disadvantaged backgrounds may have limited access to quality education, employment opportunities, and legal representation, making them more vulnerable to involvement in the criminal justice system. It was family ties, i.e. cultural capital, that got Helen, Anna Trigorin as representation. Oh, here we go. When she stabbed Rob. Inequalities in access to legal aid and effective legal representation can lead to unjust outcomes. Those who cannot afford good lawyers may be more likely to be convicted or receive harsher sentences. And we see that with losing some of the legal aid. Social capital, understood as the networks of people and community resources that individuals can draw upon, plays a crucial role. People with low social capital often experience the following. They have limited social support networks. They have fewer connections to people who can provide support, guidance, or opportunities. This can affect their ability to navigate the education system, find employment, or access pro-social networks. They also have reduced opportunities. So it's limiting their access to good education, training, and employment, which will increase the likelihood of involvement in crime. And post-release, there are challenges. Individuals with low social capital face significant barriers to reintegration. They may lack the support needed to secure housing, employment, and social connections, increasing the risk of reoffending because they will go back to what they know and who they know. And finally, I wanted to mention neurodivergency, ADHD, and the prison system. So we have, there's a lot of reports at the moment looking into ADHD within the prison system. And it's estimated that there are about 25% of young men with undiagnosed ADHD in the prison system. They're increasingly vulnerable because ADHD has the links to impulsivity, difficulties with attention and executive function, higher likelihood of social exclusion. So all of these increase the likelihood of being involved in the criminal justice system. Plus, when you think about the brain not maturing until mid to late 20s, that linked with ADHD makes those risky and silly behaviours more likely to turn into a criminal career. There's also misunderstanding and lack of support. So people with neurodivergency may not receive appropriate support or understanding in the school or justice system. Their behaviours may be misinterpreted, leading to harsher treatment. And you'll find that people with ADHD are not going to learn directly from their lessons. They will repeat the same behaviours and the same mistakes over and over again because of that part of the brain that regulates executive function. And there are challenges in the system. So the prison environment can be particularly challenging for neurodivergent individuals. Lack of routine, sensory overload, and difficulties with communication can exacerbate their conditions and increase the risk of conflict. Also, when we look at young men with dyslexia in the prison system, it's between 30 to 50%. So there's a reason why these young men are not getting the support that they need because they don't have the tools, they don't have the social capital, they can't develop the cultural capital. So using, and I'm hoping this is going to work, the QR code on the screen now, I would like you to just pop a name. It doesn't have to be one of these 4 names. I am actually going to say that Clive is misunderstood. Clive has never reached full maturity. His executive function is damaged, probably because he was whacked over the head by Bert as a child, and we should be really sorry for him. So if you vote, I'm going to have a go and see if I can see if this has worked. Right. Just going to change the screens over. Sorry, this is not smooth. Oh, it's working. So there is also on the screen. Oh, this is good. So it's just loading. Here we go. So Clive's the biggest horror on here. Tom the Twonk, love that. Matt, Brian, Tom, Rob. Who put Jazza? That's outrageous. So we are divided. And somebody's put Joy up there, which is rude. Just plain rude. Okay. I'm going to leave that going and then I'll post the results of this on the Facebook page tomorrow or later tonight. So that's it for me. Love your local Clive because you don't know what he's been through. And people like Tom should be locked up, are my final words.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was brilliant. And I absolutely love that changing word cloud. Nick, I'm going to ask you also to respond to comments within the chat rather than on live, because we're going to have to move on now. So we actually get some chance to get to the end of the day. We're going to move on now to Catherine and Deborah, who are going to look at grandfathers. Grandfathers are wise, loving and fun, or are they? Are you both there, Catherine and Deborah?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
I need somebody to remove the screen, please. Can you start sharing your screen?
Can I start sharing without? Okay. Allow
Oh,
multiple.
mine should have gone.
No, it's still there.
Oh, I know what to do.
Switch it in onto. Right. Can people see it okay? Oops.
We've still got
Now
the
I
black
can-
boxes.
Well, that's why I sent it to somebody.
Yeah.
We may have to have somebody else screen sharing. I
There we
can't do
go,
anything
we've
about-
got it. We've got
You've
it
got
now,
it, Sol?
Catherine, thank you. Yeah, that's working.
It's
That's
working?
your cover. Yeah, that's your cover slide showing now.
Okay,
Yeah.
but can you see it okay?
Yeah, there's black boxes appearing where there shouldn't be.
Do you want me to share it from mine?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hold on, I'm gonna get rid of both screens.
It's now showing rather strangely.
Yeah, and I don't know why. Okay, sorry.
It's gone backwards and forwards between Deborah and I think that may be a bit of a problem.
There we go.
Ah, there we are. Right. Okay. So I'm starting off. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Now that is the traditional way in New Zealand of addressing a group of people. And tēnā koutou is said 3 times because it acknowledges the people of the past, it acknowledges the people in the present, and it acknowledges the people who are to come in the future. And when we're thinking about grandfathers, this is highly appropriate because grandfathers are the link between the past and the present. and with their grandsons or granddaughters, the link with the future as well. Grandfathers are wise, loving, and fun, or are they? Can we move the slide on? We are dedicating our presentation to our own grandfathers, and you can tell from their names the generation in which they were born. They were born during the reign of Queen Victoria, when Albert, following the Prince Albert, was a very, very popular name. And we'd like to acknowledge our own grandfathers. We're both very lucky to know all four of our grandfathers. Moving on, our presentation looks at the literature on grandfathers, what is already known, the Ambridge grandfathers, what they can tell us, and then what does it all mean?
So I'm starting with the next section. In 2011, the British Social Attitudes Survey identified 30% of all adult women and 25% of all adult men as grandparents. Of these grandparents, 29% were still in employment. Approximately 7 in 10 were in the sandwich generation, caring for a grandchild and a parent who is still alive. In Ambridge in 2025, almost half of the grandparents are still working. The grandparent role represents one of the few social roles which does not diminish in importance in later life. Research recognises the key role healthy, long-lived grandparents play in maintaining the integrity and, in some cases, the survival of the contemporary family under conditions of social stress through providing a buffer for parents. Grandparent styles cover a wide range of approaches. One study identified a norm of non-interference on the basis of the priority of parent-child relations, with parents negotiating the level of involvement. This would often depend on geographical proximity and availability, and obviously in Ambridge that's pretty close. All the reasons that De Gesser found for helping with grandchildren can be seen in Ambridge. However, intergenerational relationships could be latent and then activated due to circumstances. Some grandparent participants in studies describe themselves as silent saviours and family watchdogs. Grandmothers are either seen explicitly or implicitly as the primary participant within the grandparent couple. Overall, there is a matrifocal tilt. A study in the north of England showed a hierarchy of grandparents, with maternal grandfathers coming second after grandmothers, and then paternal grandmothers and grandfathers, reflecting the often dyadic nature of grandparenting. And as I am from the northeast, I can confirm from my lived experience that this rings true. Could I have the next slide, please? Whilst there is a significant body of research on grandparents and grandmothers, there is limited literature on grandfathers. Grandfathering is distinct from both parenting and grandmothering. Whilst men in the studies recognised that childhood experiences had influenced both their parenting and grandfathering, they also acknowledged that their relationships with their grandchildren could be very different to those with their own children. They no longer had to fulfil the expectations of being a provider. In addition, they had more money and more patience, plus fewer responsibilities and greater available time if they were no longer working. However, one study noted that men would often downplay their role or contribution due to the perception that they had failed if they were caregivers. Can I have the next slide, please? Motivation to make more of the grandfather role was varied. Some may regret their absence as a father and want more contact. Others expressed a strong desire for more purposeful involvement with grandchildren. The type of activities grandfathers would become involved in would vary. However, with many focusing on leisure activities or those external to the house, rather than domestic or the interpersonal sphere. The transitions around grandfatherhood were for some occurring as they saw younger males taking on more active caregiving roles. There are, however, numerous comments from participants about emotional closeness with one study reporting 88% of grandfathers feeling very close to the grandchild with whom they had the most contact. However, emotional closeness decreased as grandchildren got older, and also the importance and level of satisfaction with the role once grandparents themselves aged. Grandfathers may represent the primary male figure in lone mother families or parentless families. In such situations, it is likely that they would be making a greater contribution to the family unit than most grandfathers. It is interesting to reflect on the relative levels of involvement of both David and Brian in this regard, whilst recognising that David perhaps has the greater engagement as Toby is geographically distant, whereas Chris is an active co-parent. Brian stepped up to the grandparent role far more during the crisis of Alice's drinking, rather than, for example, maintaining a daily involvement in the nursery run. Should Jenny have lived longer, it is unlikely that Brian would have played as much of a role during those challenging times. So over to Catherine now.
Catherine, you're muted.
You're muted, and we need to go back a slide.
Can we go back to the previous slide? It doesn't look as though we have, sorry, I sent the wrong set of slides, the first email, never mind. So you can see we had literature from quite a wide range of era from 1985 to the present day. And much of the earlier literature is as relevant today as it was in 1985 if it relates to emotional or spiritual kind of roles. If it relates to the practical aspect of what the grandparents are doing with the children, then the later literature is quite different to what was seen in 1985. So grandparents now undertake a much wider range of activities with grandchildren. There is much more hands-on caring for the grandchildren than there might have been 30 or 40 years ago. Looking at a range of models, de Giese comes up with a model that is based on practical roles. What the grandparent or the grandfather is doing with the grandchildren. Are they doing the more fun things, the recreational things, or are they doing the hands-on caring? Bates was looking at generative grandfathering, including recreation, but also looking at spirituality, moral codes, identity, and lineage, looking across generations at how family stories are passed on from one generation to another. Neugarten and Weinstein's 1964 model is still being cited. It combined both the practical and the emotional. But one of the very oldest models, which is centuries old, comes from the indigenous people in North America, the 7 teachings of grandfathers. It has been passed down from generation to generation over centuries orally. The 7 teachings refer to things like love, respect, honesty, bravery, humility, truth, and wisdom. Can we move on? So combining these models, we see 6 different groups of different types of grandfathers. A grandfather can be in more than one of these groups. They can be in 2 or 3, or they can just be in one. Generally, however, the grandfather that is the more formal, less involved, such as Brian and possibly Robert, generally tend to only be in that group. These are grandfathers who perhaps see the children irregularly, they pat them on the head, they tell them how wonderful they are and how much they love them, but there is very little emotional involvement with them. It can be in part due to the fact that there may be a geographical distancing between this grandfather and the grandchildren, as we see with Robert. On the other hand, we have exactly the reverse. The hands-on, almost the parent substitute, the babysitter, they might tell the children off from time to time. They are doing some of the practical things. Now, in our case, it's the grandfathers who live very, very close to their grandchildren. And often this is generated a little bit by the attitude of the grandmother. The grandmother is doing more of these things, and so the grandfather is tagging along. The fun seeker is harder to find in this generation than perhaps it was in previous generations. Joe is probably the most obvious. We're talking about Joe Grundy, who is no longer with us, is probably the most obvious aspect there. They want to have involvement with their grandchildren only in relation to fun. The reservoir of family wisdom, and we interpret wisdom in the widest possible sense. They are the custodians of family heritage. They pass on the honour and the codes and the stories from one generation to another. And we, with hesitation, put Eddie in this group because we wouldn't generally relate Eddie with the word wisdom. However, Eddie sees the Grundy Code as being wisdom. It is wisdom to him. It is wisdom to the Grundy family. Tony is passing on wisdom, but perhaps the ultimate reservoir of family wisdom was the grandfather from years ago of Dan Archer. He was regarded by all his grandchildren, particularly, and his granddaughters as well, as being grandpa. We also see, from time to time, confidence, where grandfathers will tell their grandsons, in particular, things that they wouldn't tell anybody else. They comment about perhaps concerns they might have about grandma. Grandsons tell their grandfather things that they wouldn't tell anybody else. And most of the Archers' grandfathers have been a confidant to their grandsons in some way at some point, some more than others. And then just very recently, we have seen Tony as the teacher, teaching Henry about farming. As we mentioned before, grandfathers can form into more than one of these groups. However, if they tend to be the formal and less involved, they tend to only sit in that group. Let's look at George and his two grandfathers, and we're on the next slide. There is a profound difference between Eddie and Neil, both in the way they react to George and the way George reacts to them. They both love him. It is absolutely clear that they love him, but they express that love very differently. Eddie goes along with George, he supports him, he will try and make sure that any practical outcome of George's actions, the practical consequences, are reduced, whereas Neil is very much thinking that George needs to form a part of the community and needs to be behaving appropriately. And he might be passing on what George sees as tough love, but George doesn't even interpret that as love at all. We see the family wisdom, the Grundy Code, which the Grundys do regard as wisdom, against the more conventional moral code of Neil. The different way George views his grandfathers was discussed last night when George was actually with us. But even before the recent incident and his going to prison, George was at Barrow, and there were some of the issues that we see now then. And even before that, Neil has been much more at arm's length than Eddie has ever been. Eddie has been a constant in George's life. There may have been confusion between his father and his stepfather, but he can always rely on Eddie. And Eddie is his grandfather. He can rely on Eddie in the way that he wants to rely on Eddie. Neil can be relied upon to be telling him what he possibly ought to be doing, but doesn't want to. When we start to move on to conclusions, the grandfather may not reflect the comparable by grandmother. Whilst Brian might be a hands-off grandfather, Jennifer wasn't, and so they were behaving quite differently. There are two conflicting things happening with grandfathers. In one respect, they're drawing on their experience as a father and what they learnt from their grandfather, and so intergenerational transmission of practices. In that respect, you'd expect grandfathers to behave the same way over generations. However, there is the changing role occurring with grandfathers becoming involved in more practical things. What could the future of grandfatherhood be in Ambridge? Will we see the same people as grandfathers, or will we suddenly see Kenton starting to take an interest in grandchildren? Will we see the Grundy Code being more prevalent? But we're going to leave the last word to a Grundy. If we could move on. E. Grundy is a South American academic. Her name is Emily Grundy. We don't know whether she's related to Eddie or not. We suspect possibly not, but she has researched grandfathers, and she has done quite a comprehensive study and come up with the following: that grandfathers providing help to grandchildren was associated with positive indicators of mental health, better life satisfaction for those providing 4 or more hours per week of help. She, however, finds that is not the same for grandmothers. But on the question of are grandfathers loving, wise, and fun, in Ambridge there are some of each, but there doesn't appear to be anybody who is all three.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Deborah. I think that was really interesting, and I love the Grundy link at the end. And again, I think there are quite a few comments in the chat if you'd like to respond to those as you go along, sort of later. Okay, so I'm now going to hand back to Cara if she's around, who will be taking us into the final session of the day. Cara?
I am here. Sorry about that.
Says
Just
hello.